I never imagined how deeply their cruelty would scar me. It's strange how pain like that can feel so immediate, so intense in the moment, but still linger long after the bruises have faded and the wounds have closed. Physical scars are one thing. You can see them, touch them, and even though they remind you of what happened, you can convince yourself that they're part of your past. But emotional scars, those are the ones that don't leave. No matter how hard you try to bury them, they become a part of you. A ghost that hovers just behind your every thought, your every decision. I can still remember their words. You'd think it would be the physical actions that stand out the most, but no, it's the words that hurt the worst. The things they said, the way they twisted my reality, made me question my own worth. I started to wonder if maybe I deserved the cruelty, if maybe I had done something to provoke it. That's the thing about people who are cruel. They make you believe that you're the problem, that somehow you brought this on yourself. And that belief, once it settles in, takes root in your mind, spreading like a poison. There were days when I couldn't escape it, when the weight of their cruelty was so overwhelming that I felt like I couldn't breathe. I'd be sitting in my room, trying to distract myself with anything I could, music, books, television. But their words, their laughter, their dismissive glances would seep into my thoughts like smoke. It felt like I was suffocating on the memories, like I'd never be able to breathe freely again. And I hated it. I hated that they had this power over me, even when they weren't physically there. I hated that their cruelty had become this invisible chain, binding me to the pain they caused. But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it was always there. The shame, the self-doubt, the constant replay of every hurtful thing they said and did. I'd lie awake at night, going over every moment in my head, wondering what I could have done differently. Could I have stood up for myself more? Could I have fought back? Or was I destined to be their target no matter what I did? It was a cycle I couldn't break, no matter how much time passed. Yet deep down, there was a part of me that knew the truth, that it wasn't my fault, that their cruelty was a reflection of their own insecurities, their own unresolved pain. But that didn't make it easier to bear. Knowing that they were the problem didn't erase the damage they had done to me. And so I carried it with me, this burden of their cruelty, unsure if I'd ever be free from it. It's funny how even when you think you've left it behind, cruelty has a way of creeping back into your life. Even after I distanced myself from them, after I cut ties and tried to move on, the echoes of their betrayal followed me everywhere. It wasn't just the memories, it was the way their actions had changed me. I became someone different, someone I didn't recognize. I was constantly on edge, always waiting for the next attack, even when I was in the safest of places. Trust, once something I gave so freely, became a rare and precious thing. I questioned everyone's intentions, doubted their sincerity, because how could I not? When people you once trusted turn on you, it leaves you paranoid, constantly wondering who else might betray you. But it wasn't just about me. Their betrayal didn't stay confined to the past. It showed up in the way I interacted with the world, in the way I hesitated to open up to new people, the way I withdrew into myself at the slightest hint of conflict. It was as if they had infected my mind with their cruelty, and now it was spreading, affecting every part of my life. Even when I thought I had moved on, Their actions continued to cast a shadow over everything I did. They didn't just betray me in that moment. They betrayed every future version of me, every relationship I tried to build, every bit of trust I tried to give. And the worst part was, they didn't even seem to care. They went on with their lives as if nothing had happened, as if their betrayal was just a blip on the radar, something to be forgotten and moved past. But for me, it was like carrying a weight that no one else could see. They had moved on, but I was still stuck, trapped in the aftermath of what they had done. The cruelty they inflicted might have been brief for them, but for me, it was a constant presence, a reminder of how fragile trust could be. I started to realize that the cruelty they had shown me wasn't something I could simply leave behind. It had become a part of my story, woven into the fabric of who I was. But as much as I wanted to let it go, as much as I wanted to move forward, I couldn't escape the feeling that their betrayal would follow me for the rest of my life. The echoes of what they had done reverberated through my mind, reminding me that the damage wasn't something that could be easily repaired. It was permanent, a scar that I would carry with me forever. Then something shifted. It wasn't all at once. It was subtle at first, like a crack in the facade. I started hearing things, small snippets of information that trickled back to me, that they weren't doing as well as they had once seemed. The confident, carefree front they had always put up was starting to falter. At first, I didn't think much of it. People go through rough patches all the time. It didn't necessarily mean anything. But then the stories kept coming. They were struggling in ways I had never imagined, ways that mirrored the pain they had caused me. It was almost like watching the universe slowly, methodically, turn the tables on them. For so long, I had felt powerless, trapped under the weight of their cruelty. But now, it seemed like the roles were reversing. They were the ones starting to feel the pressure, the isolation, the consequences of their actions. It wasn't some grand act of revenge, nothing I had orchestrated or even wished for, but I could see it happening. Their cruelty, the things they had done to me, were starting to catch up with them. The very things they had done to tear me down were now tearing them apart. I started to hear about how their relationships were falling apart, how their friends were turning their backs on them. It was as if the same betrayal they had shown me was now being mirrored in their own lives. They were losing the trust of the people around them, just as they had shattered mine. And the more they tried to hide it, the more obvious it became that they were struggling under the weight of their own actions. It's strange how life works like that. At first, I didn't want to believe it. It felt too much like poetic justice, like something out of a story, not real life. But the more I watched, the more I saw the cracks in their facade, the more I realized that this wasn't some coincidence. Their cruelty had consequences, and they were starting to feel them. They thought they could get away with what they had done, that they could move on without ever facing the repercussions. But life doesn't work that way. The things you do, the pain you cause, it always comes back around, one way or another. And in a way, I felt a strange sense of relief. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because it showed me that there was some balance in the world, that the cruelty they had shown me wasn't something that could simply be brushed aside or forgotten. It was like the universe had taken notice, had decided that they needed to face the same kind of pain they had inflicted. And as much as I had tried to move on, to let go of what they had done. There was something satisfying in knowing that their actions were finally catching up to them. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't about me getting back at them. It was simply the natural order of things, the way life has a way of balancing itself out. And as I watched them struggle under the weight of their own cruelty, I realized that I didn't need to carry that weight anymore. Their actions were no longer my burden to bear. They were being haunted by their own choices, just as I had once been haunted by their cruelty. The tables had turned, and now it was their turn to face the consequences of what they had done. Regret is a strange thing. It starts small, like a seed planted deep inside you, something you think you can ignore or push aside. But over time, it grows, spreading its roots into every corner of your mind until it becomes something you can't escape. I started to see it in them, that seed of regret, even if they didn't want to admit it. They carried themselves differently, spoke with less confidence. Their laughter wasn't as full. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes. At first, I wondered if I was imagining it, if I was projecting my own hopes onto them. But the signs were there, unmistakable. It wasn't immediate, but little by little, I could see the weight of what they had done to me starting to settle on their shoulders. Regret for them was a slow burn. I don't think they even realized it at first. People like them rarely do. They go through life believing they're invincible, that their actions won't come back to bite them. But slowly and perceptibly it began to creep into their lives. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the choices they had made, the people they had hurt, the trust they had broken. It was like they were starting to realize that their cruelty had a ripple effect, touching more lives than just mine. And those ripples were now circling back to them. I started hearing things through mutual acquaintances, little snippets of conversations that hinted at their unease. They were starting to have trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares that kept them tossing and turning. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something they couldn't quite put their finger on was following them. Of course, they didn't want to admit it, not to themselves, and certainly not to anyone else. But it was clear that they were haunted by the things they had done. Regret had taken root in their lives, and no matter how much they tried to ignore it, it was there, growing stronger with each passing day. The guilt was there too, though they were far too proud to show it openly. It manifested in subtle ways, in their attempts to be overly kind to others, as if they were trying to make up for the harm they had caused. But kindness born from guilt is a fragile thing. It doesn't come from a place of true empathy. It's driven by the need to quiet the voices inside their own heads. They weren't being kind because they had changed, but because they were trying to escape the weight of their own conscience. And it didn't work. No matter how many acts of kindness they performed, no matter how many people they tried to impress with their newfound generosity, the guilt remained. It clung to them like a shadow, a constant reminder of the cruelty they had once so easily inflicted. It was almost painful to watch in a way. They thought they could erase the past, that they could wash away their guilt with good deeds. But regret doesn't work like that. It's relentless. It doesn't care how many apologies you offer or how many favors you do for others. Once it's there, once you've crossed that line, it sticks with you. I saw it in their eyes, the way they looked away when certain topics came up, the way they avoided conversations that might bring up their past actions. They couldn't face it. They couldn't admit that they had been wrong, and yet I could see that it was eating them alive. It became clear that they were trying to make amends, though they didn't know how. I'd get random messages, carefully worded apologies that never quite said what needed to be said. It was always something vague, something like, "I know I wasn't always the best person," or "I hope you're doing well these days." But they never truly owned up to what they had done. They couldn't bring themselves to say the words that mattered. It was as if admitting the full extent of their cruelty would be too much for them to handle, too much for them to bear. So they danced around it, offering half-hearted apologies that did little to ease the tension. But regret doesn't let you off the hook so easily. The more they tried to make things right, the more tangled they became in their own guilt. They couldn't escape it. I could see it in the way they carried themselves, the way they tried to avoid eye contact whenever we happened to cross paths. It was clear that their regret was more than just a passing feeling. It had become a part of them, something they couldn't shake no matter how hard they tried. And the more they tried to run from it, the more it clung to them. Their regret wasn't just internal, though. It started to bleed into their relationships, into the way they interacted with the people around them. They became more isolated, more distant. Friends who had once been close to them started to drift away, sensing that something wasn't right. Their attempts to mask their guilt and regret only made them seem more hollow, more disconnected. They couldn't maintain the facade anymore, and the people around them began to notice. The lies they had once told, the cruelty they had once inflicted, it all started to unravel. They were losing control, and the more they tried to hold on, the more everything slipped through their fingers. It wasn't long before their regret turned into something more. It became an obsession, a constant companion that followed them wherever they went. I heard stories about how they would bring up the past in conversations, how they would hint at their guilt without ever fully confessing it. It was as if they were trying to find some sort of release, some way to unburden themselves, but they couldn't, because the truth was too painful, too heavy. They couldn't face the reality of what they had done, and so they remained trapped, haunted by their own actions. I think in some way, they thought that time would heal everything, that eventually the weight of their regret would fade, and they could move on. But regret doesn't fade. It festers, it grows, intensifies until it's all-consuming, and that's what happened to them. Their regret became so overwhelming that it started to affect every part of their life. Their work suffered, their friendships crumbled, and even their health began to decline. They were plagued by constant stress, anxiety, and a deep sense of unease that they couldn't shake. No matter where they turned, there was no escape from the regret that had taken hold of them. I watched from a distance as they spiraled, as their regret consumed them bit by bit. It wasn't something I took pleasure in. I didn't want to see them suffer, not really. But at the same time, I couldn't help but feel that this was the natural consequence of their actions. They had inflicted so much pain, so much harm, without a second thought. And now they were being forced to face the reality of what they had done. Regret was their punishment, their penance. It was the ghost of their past, a reminder that no matter how much they tried to run from it, they couldn't escape the consequences of their cruelty. In the end, regret became their prison. It locked them inside their own minds, trapping them in a cycle of guilt and shame that they couldn't break free from. They tried to make things right, to find some sort of redemption, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologies or good deeds could undo it. Regret had taken hold of them, and it wasn't going to let go. They were haunted by their own actions, by the choices they had made, and that was something they would have to live with for the rest of their lives. In the quiet moments, when they were alone with their thoughts, I imagined they couldn't escape the images of the pain they caused, the faces of those they had hurt, the memories of the things they had done. Regret isn't something you can outrun. It follows you, quietly at first, then louder and louder, until it's all you can hear. For them, that regret would never go away. It would haunt them forever. Forgiveness is something I never thought I'd be able to consider, especially not after everything they had put me through. For the longest time, the idea of forgiveness felt like a betrayal to myself, to the pain I had endured, to the version of me who had suffered in silence while their cruelty tore me apart. The very thought of forgiving them felt like admitting that what they did was somehow excusable, that the wounds they inflicted on me weren't as deep as they truly were. I couldn't imagine letting go of the anger, the hurt, the bitterness. I couldn't imagine being free from it, because in some strange way, holding on to that pain had become a part of my identity. For so long, their cruelty had shaped the way I saw the world, the way I saw myself. It had left me guarded, closed off, always ready to defend myself from the next attack. I built walls around my heart, around my emotions, because that felt like the only way to survive. It wasn't just about protecting myself from them, but from anyone who might try to hurt me again. I told myself that holding on to my anger was necessary, that it was my armor, my shield, and maybe, in some ways, it was. It kept me safe from further harm, but over time, that armor began to weigh me down, and I started to realize that it wasn't just protecting me, it was also trapping me. There's a strange comfort in anger, in holding on to the belief that the people who hurt you deserve to suffer. It gives you a sense of power, of control, especially when you felt powerless for so long. But the more I clung to that anger, the more I realized that it wasn't hurting them. It was only hurting me. They were off living their lives, dealing with their own regrets and guilt, but they weren't the ones waking up every morning with a knot of bitterness in their chest. They weren't the ones losing sleep, reliving the memories of what they had done. That was me. And slowly, painfully, I started to understand that by holding on to my anger, I was still giving them control over my life. That realization didn't come easily. It took time, years even, for me to reach a place where I could begin to contemplate what forgiveness might look like. It wasn't about rushing to a decision, or pretending that the pain wasn't there. It was about sitting with that pain, acknowledging it, and asking myself if I wanted to carry it with me for the rest of my life. I had to ask myself if their cruelty was something I wanted to define me forever. The answer, surprisingly, was no. I didn't want to be tied to them anymore. Didn't want their actions to continue to dictate how I lived my life. But letting go of that anger meant doing something even harder. Letting go of the need for justice, for revenge, for retribution. And that was something I struggled with for a long time. I had to come to terms with the fact that forgiveness wasn't about them. It wasn't about absolving them of what they had done or pretending that it hadn't happened. It was about me and my own peace of mind. It was about freeing myself from the chains of the past, from the constant replay of their cruelty in my mind. I realized that holding on to my pain wasn't punishing them, it was punishing me. I was the one who was stuck in that cycle of bitterness and resentment, and I was the one who had the power to break free from it. But breaking free meant releasing my grip on the anger that had been my constant companion for so long, and that was terrifying. Forgiveness isn't a switch that you flip, or a decision you make once and never think about again. It's a process, a journey. There were days when I thought I had forgiven them, when I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. But then something would trigger a memory, a passing comment, a familiar scent, a place we had once been, and the anger would surge back, as fresh and raw as ever. It was in those moments that I realized forgiveness wasn't a one-time thing. It was something I had to choose, again and again, every time the pain resurfaced. I had to remind myself that forgiveness wasn't about condoning what they had done. It was about refusing to let their actions continue to control my life. At first, it felt impossible. How could I forgive people who had shown me such cruelty, who had betrayed me in ways that I never thought possible? How could I release them from the responsibility of what they had done? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that forgiveness wasn't about releasing them. It was about releasing myself. I wasn't forgiving them for their sake. I was forgiving them for mine. I was choosing to let go of the burden of anger because I didn't want to carry it anymore. I didn't want to wake up every day with the weight of their cruelty pressing down on me. I wanted to be free. That freedom didn't come overnight. It came in small, quiet moments, in the spaces between my thoughts. It came in the decision to stop replaying the past, to stop obsessing over what they had done and what I wished I had said or done in response. It came in the realization that no matter how much I wished things could have been different, I couldn't change the past. What I could change was how I allowed that past to affect my present and my future. Forgiveness in that sense wasn't about changing them. It was about changing me. The hardest part was letting go of the need for validation. For so long, I had wanted them to acknowledge the depth of the pain they had caused me. I wanted them to apologize, to truly understand what they had done and how it had affected me. But as time went on, I began to see that I might never get that. They might never fully grasp the impact of their actions, and even if they did, their apologies wouldn't undo the damage. Waiting for their acknowledgement was just another way of keeping myself tied to the past. If I was going to move forward, I had to stop waiting for them to give me something they might never be able to offer. Forgiveness for me became less about them and more about reclaiming my own sense of power. It was about deciding that their cruelty wouldn't define me anymore, that I wouldn't let their actions shape the rest of my life. I started to realize that I had the power to write my own story, to decide how I wanted to live from here on out, and in that realization came a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but slowly I began to feel lighter. The anger that had once consumed me started to fade, replaced by a sense of peace that I hadn't thought possible. There were still moments when the pain resurfaced, when the memories of what they had done would creep back into my mind. But in those moments, I reminded myself that I was in control. I had the power to choose how I responded to those memories, to those feelings. I didn't have to let them drag me back into the darkness. I could acknowledge the pain, honor it, and then let it go. And each time I made that choice, it became a little easier, a little less overwhelming. I was no longer bound by their cruelty, no longer defined by what they had done to me. I was free. Forgiving them didn't mean forgetting what had happened, or pretending that it didn't matter. It didn't mean excusing their actions or erasing the past. It simply meant choosing to no longer let that past hold power over me. It meant choosing to live for myself, to find peace within myself, rather than waiting for them to give it to me. In the end, forgiveness wasn't about them at all. It was about me. It was about taking back control of my life, and finally allowing myself to move forward, unburdened by the weight of their cruelty. Their cruelty may haunt them forever, but it won't haunt me. I've let it go, and in doing so, I've found something even more powerful than justice: peace.